seeking the origins of the Panther, regarded as one of the finest medium tanks of the Second World War, we must turn back to examine the consequences for the German army, and in particular the tank arm, of Hitler's momentous decision to order the Wehrmacht eastward against the Soviet Union. At 0300 hours, on June 22, 1941, the eastern horizon from the Baltic coast to the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains was lit up by the fire from a barrage of 6,000 heavy guns, providing the overture to Operation Barbarossa, the German assault on the Soviet Union and the greatest land invasion in history. 3 million men with 3,350 tanks and supported by some 2,000 aircraft of the Luftwaffe poured across the frontier, bent on employing the now well-tested Blitzkrieg formula to defeat the USSR in a rapid campaign which Adolf Hitler expected to last no more than a few months. The dictator of Nazi Germany viewed the Soviet Union with derision, claiming its image as a powerful modern state was a sham. He said, "We have only to kick in the front door and the whole rotten structure will come tumbling down." Such delusion, while grounded in the first instance on his anti-Semitic, anti-Marxist and overtly racist philosophy, which reduced the Slavs, and thus the Russians, to the level of mere subhumans in the Nazi worldview, was also heavily coloured by a German intelligence analysis of Soviet military and economic power that was profoundly flawed. This analysis, which underlay German planning for Barbarossa, was remarkable more for what it did not know about this new enemy than what it did. Thus, numbers of aircraft and tanks in Soviet service were not known, figures proffered being mere guesses. Little was known of the Soviet order of battle, or of the detailed organisation of Soviet military formations, nor had the Germans any inkling of the profound changes wrought on Soviet industry by the 5-year plans, and thus of the potential of the USSR to fight a prolonged war. In short, the German armed forces had plunged into war with the Soviet Union, sustained only by the unsubstantiated conviction that the Red Army was not fit to engage in a modern conflict and would be unable to defend itself against the most modern and effective war machine in existence. And yet, all that happened in the opening months of the campaign seemed to substantiate German beliefs about the state of the Red Army and the nature of the Soviet state. Unbeknown to the Germans, however, they had chosen to attack at the worst possible moment for the Soviet Union. The Red Army was not only attempting to recover from the impact of the devastating effect of the purges that had decimated the Soviet officer corps, but also from the shame of its performance in the Winter War against Finland. In June 1941, it was also in the throes of massive internal change, including a huge re-equipment program. Although the German panzer columns tore through the Soviet defences, driving deep into the hinterland and encircling hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in massive pockets within weeks of the opening of the campaign, there were more than a few indications that led many Germans to realise that this new war in the East would be quite unlike that fought the summer before. One officer in the 18th Panzer Division wrote, "There was no feeling, as there had been in France, of entry into a defeated nation. Instead, there was resistance, always resistance, however hopeless." Indeed, even Hitler sensed as much, telling Mussolini that Soviet soldiers fought with truly stupid fanaticism, with the primitive brutality of an animal that sees itself trapped. While the Führer, no doubt, saw such as confirming evidence of the subhuman nature of the Russians, even he could not have missed that these same subhumans had already killed over 100,000 German troops in the opening weeks of Barbarossa, more than in all the previous campaigns combined. Nor were the Germans oblivious to the seemingly endless numbers of Soviet divisions that made their appearance on the battlefield, only to be fed into the German mincing machine, then replaced by more. By the end of July, the Germans had already identified more Soviet divisions than they estimated the Red Army possessed. The Soviets were profligate with their manpower, but in the face of the rapidity of the German advance and their unpreparedness to cope with blitzkrieg, they had to trade lives and space for time. Thousands and thousands, then hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. One German soldier later recalled, "The earth-brown crocodile slowly shuffled down the road towards us. Prisoners of war, Russians, 6 deep. We couldn't see the end of the column. As they drew near, the terrible stench which met us made us feel quite sick. We made haste out of the way of the foul cloud which surrounded them. Then what we saw transfixed us where we stood, and we forgot our nausea." Were these really human beings, those grey-brown figures, those shadows lurching towards us, stumbling and staggering, moving shapes at their last gasp, creatures which only some flicker of the will to live enabled them to obey the order to march? On July the 16th, less than a month after the beginning of Barbarossa, the city of Smolensk, just 200 miles from Moscow, fell to the panzers of Generals Hoth and Guderian. In their drive eastward, German armour had brushed aside or destroyed large numbers of Soviet tanks. Guderian had estimated before the start of the campaign that the Red Army possessed a tank park of about 10,000 machines, and this was the benchmark accepted by the army. However, it was becoming all too clear that this figure was much too small, and that the real figure was in excess of some 20,000 tanks. Hitler later stated to Guderian that had he known Russian tank strength to have been as large, he would have seriously reconsidered his decision to invade Russia. Numbers, though, did not equal quality. By far and away, the bulk of Soviet armour was obsolete. Most of the designs dated back to the early 30s, drawing heavily on foreign designs. What the newsreels show the most of are wrecked and burning T-26s, T-28s, T-37s, and light tanks of the BT series. None mounted a gun larger than 45mm, and all had thin armour. The short-barrelled 50mm gun of the Panzer III and the short 75mm gun of the Panzer IV had no difficulty destroying these tanks, and the footage herein shows large numbers of these tanks destroyed and on fire. Even the 20mm cannon of the Panzer II light tank and the 37mm gun on the Panzer 38T had no difficulty taking out these light Soviet designs. Even the large and impressive T-35 multi-turreted tank seen here was highly vulnerable to German fire. But amid this welter of obsolescence, there were a number of new designs that sent shockwaves through the Panzerwaffe. In the KV-1 and KV-2, the Soviets had two machines technologically superior to any German tank. With armour as thick as that encountered on the British Matilda, and heavy armament as well, in the case of the KV-1, a 76mm gun, and on the KV-2, a 152mm howitzer, these were truly formidable machines. Shells from German tanks bounced off the armour of these monsters. But it was the T-34 that made the greatest impression. Fast, weighing some 26 tons, with well-sloped heavy armour, and carrying a 76mm gun, it came as a revelation to the German tankers. Luckily, it was only available in small numbers and poorly employed. The T-34 being examined here is the earliest model, coming off the production line in 1940. As in France, when dealing with the heavily armoured British and French tanks, the 88mm flak gun was found to be able to deal with the new Soviet tank designs. German infantry found other methods for destroying T-34s and KVs. Satchel charges were placed on the Soviet machines, although this required great nerve, as a soldier had to run up to the tank in order to deposit the charge on the engine deck or wedge it below the turret overhang. Such methods were quite often the only fallback in the absence of an effective anti-tank gun, the 37mm gun proving totally useless, as it was unable to penetrate the Soviet tank's armour. It was only with the launch of Operation Typhoon, the German offensive to capture Moscow, in late September 1941, that the T-34 became a real threat to the Panzers. With the onset of the Rasputitsa, a period of rains before the start of winter, and which turned Russian roads into quagmires, the German Panzers sank up to their axles because of their narrow tracks, whereas the T-34 coped with the conditions because theirs were much broader. At Midzensk on the 4th of October, T-34s operated in large numbers for the first time, inflicting heavy casualties on the Panzer IIIs of the 4th Panzer Division. Guderian was later to comment that it was at the Battle of Midzensk that for the first time the vast superiority of the T-34 became plainly apparent to the Germans. And when Typhoon finally ground to an exhausted halt at the beginning of December, large numbers of T-34s belonging to the fresh divisions in training from Siberia led the Soviet counteroffensive in front of Moscow on December the 5th, 1941. By then it had become apparent to the German army that it had to take steps to address the clear technological superiority in tank design possessed by the Soviets and represented in the T-34. In October, a Panzer Commission met with General Heinz Guderian at Orel in Russia to consider ways of responding to the T-34, in addition to continuing development of the heavy Tiger tank. The decision was taken to proceed with production of a new medium Panzer under the designation VK-3002, contracts for which were issued within days of the return to Germany. The initially favoured design from Daimler-Benz clearly reflected the influence of the T-34, with heavily sloping armour and turret mounted far forward on the hull. On May the 15th, 1942, Hitler acceded to the recommendations of a report that favoured production of the alternative design submission from the MAN company. The prototype MAN Panther incorporated the many changes foisted on the design team in the course of the new Panzer's development. Weight had grown to 45 tons, and the tank now mounted the longer and more formidable 75mm L-70 gun. Contracts were issued in September 1942 for 1,000 Panthers, with the first leaving the MAN works in January 1943.